Welcome, Dr. Axelrad.
All right, best for last, home stretch. So I'm going to be maybe equally as philosophical as Dave just was, but we're going to talk about the gut microbiome. And I'm going to try to frame this in a way that's useful, right? And make it maybe less about the exact science of everything and more practical points, since we're reading about the gut microbiome all the time and we're hearing more and more about it and different therapies that may be directed towards the gut microbiome. So I'll frame it in that way. So first we'll discuss, what exactly is the gut microbiome, how it's involved in inflammatory bowel disease, pathogenesis and pathophysiology. We'll talk about what influences the gut microbiome, how this relates to IBD and the disease course, and then we'll talk about some therapeutics. Fecal transplant we've all heard a bunch about, antibiotics, microbial therapeutics. We'll talk about all these. Okay, so what is the gut microbiome, right? The gut microbiota is the largest reservoir of microbes in the body. There's actually more microbes inside of you and on you than there are cells in your own body, right? So there's 40 trillion microbes in your body, and that's 10 trillion more than there are cells of your body. So you are more microbes than you are your own cells, to put that into context. So literally there is an ecosystem that coexists with you, right? And sometimes that ecosystem doesn't interact the way we want it to, and we'll talk about that. So what does the gut microbiota actually do? Well, it supplies nutrients and energy, vitamins, short-chain fatty acid production, some of these essential factors for homeostasis. It also plays a role in host defenses, right? So if you eat something that maybe was not right and you ended up with food poisoning or an infection or something like that, there are antimicrobial factors in the gut and all sorts of resistance to colonization of bad actors that may protect you. And that's also how the gut microbiota functions. And then probably most important is that the microbes inside of you interact with your immune system. And so you develop a multitude of both T and B cell effectors which help protect you and in some ways may not protect you, like in inflammatory bowel disease where there's perhaps a disorder here and the immune system is overreactive to some of the microbes in the gut. So there's tolerance and there's development of the immune system, and the gut microbiota play a critical role in that interaction. Okay, so the best way to really think about this is that the microbes inside of you some are good, some are maybe bad, and some we really have no idea what they're doing, right? So when you're talking about 40 trillion organisms, it's hard to know necessarily what all of them are doing or how they're interacting with each other or how they interact with us, right? So this is what we're trying to understand. In inflammatory bowel disease, we have at least found a lot of characteristics that seem to be consistent across studies, right? So you've heard about this thing called diversity. So it's in patients with inflammatory bowel disease, we sort of on the whole generally find less microbiota diversity in the gastrointestinal tract, and we're gonna review some of that. So I think what's most important, because many patients ask me about the gut microbiome and diet, and we heard a great talk on diet, and I just need to take a probiotic or change my diet and everything's gonna get better. As we try to figure out, why me, right? Why am I sick? Why is this happening to me? Is it my gut microbiome, but is that one aspect that we can modify, right? As patients, we're always thinking what's my modifiable behavior that I can do to fix this, or why did I get this? What behavior or what happened that led me to get this? So the why me point of this is that the gut microbiota is a part of us, right? And we're just starting to scratch the surface in how we can use this, the gut microbiome as a tool, in inflammatory bowel disease as a therapeutic pathway. So this is important to frame it. And in thinking about why me, I put this up as really a joke, but this is why. So if you're ever wondering why you took a drug and it didn't work well enough, or you got a stricture, or you got a fistula, or you took multiple drugs and they didn't work well, this is why. Because inflammatory bowel disease is very, very complex. And while we're just talking about one little aspect of it in this talk, which is the microbes that you can see in the lumen of the GI tract. The lumen at the top, then you have the border, the epithelial cells, or this sort of reddish layer, then where most of the immune function live in this thing called the lamina propria, and then below this is a blood cell. And you could see IBD is extremely complex. So this is why when you took infliximab or adalimumab or vedolizumab and it didn't go super well, this is why, because it's incredibly complex. And the gut microbiota is just one part of that. But here you're seeing T cells and some B cells and lymph nodes, and there's just a lot here. So it's complex. The microbiome is one tiny little part of this picture. And so that's exactly why we have, lucky that we have more drugs, but our drugs aren't 100%. And that's why many of our patients still require surgery or multiple surgeries. And so it's an extremely complex picture, and the microbiota is just one part of this story. So I don't like to think about it like this. Even when I give talks to our medical school students, this is very confusing, or informative but confusing, and this is really the better way to think about it, is that the gut microbiota is a key part of why patients develop and maintain inflammatory bowel disease, and it seems to be that there are changes in the gut microbiome and environmental triggers in genetically susceptible folks and leads to a disordered immune response. And that's the simplest way to think about IBD and how the gut microbiome plays a role in this. So this is how I think about it. This is how I explain it to patients. This makes it a lot easier for all of us. Okay. So in learning about the gut microbiome, we're starting to understand that actually our genetic component has a lot to do with this. And so many of the genes that are implicated in inflammatory bowel disease, and now there are hundreds, and again, that speaks to why it's complex, right? It's not you have one gene that gives you disease. This is an extremely complex disease. Many of the genes that are involved in inflammatory bowel disease that have been identified have to do with the sensing of gut microbiota, right? So that maybe that sensor in your gut is disordered. And that's what sort of leads to some of this dysregulation. So there's genetic predispositions, and a lot of those genetic predispositions seem to be related to interactions with the gut microbiome. And we use the word dysbiosis a lot. So we talk about patients with IBD, their gut microbiome is dysbiotic or dysbiosis. And basically this just means there's a change. There's decrease in commensals or the good guys or the good peacekeeping bacteria, and an increase in some of the immunogenic or pathogenic microbes. So that's one way of thinking about it. And then, I didn't mention here, but what's important also is that we're talking about the gut microbiota. We talk a lot about bacteria, but the gut microbiota also includes viruses, viral elements. It includes fungal elements as well. There's many different aspects of the gut microbiome that are beyond just actual bacteria. Okay, so we talked about gut microbes. So what influences the microbiome? Lots of our environment, right? Not just what you eat, which we heard a lot about, and it explains why there's some therapeutic benefit to changes in the diet, but our environment has a direct impact on the composition of our gut. And so cigarette smoking definitely influences the gut microbiome. We found things like early appendectomy actually reduce the risk of ulcerative colitis. Now, why is that? Because the appendix has its own microbiome, and there's probably something protective in that microbiome that when it's removed, that risk of ulcerative colitis development seems to go down. And we find that this is associated with changes in the microbiome. Antibiotics, many studies, this is some graphs from studies looking at those who were exposed to antibiotics compared to unexposed, and also how many courses of antibiotics we've had. So we were all young, and even as adults, we get antibiotics all the time. I think nowadays there's a little more resistance in terms of just using antibiotics for the sniffles. But 20, 30 years ago, there was a lot of antibiotics for the sniffles, and that the antibiotics have a huge impact on the gut microbiome. And there's now numerous studies, not just linking antibiotic use with the subsequent development of inflammatory bowel disease, but also other immune-mediated diseases, thyroid disease, rheumatoid arthritis, psoriasis, and whatnot. So there's a clear link here. Now, of course, this is just one part of it, right? It's not that, when I was a kid and I had an earache, my parents always gave me a Z-Pak, and now I have Crohn's. That's not it, but it's clearly a part of it. Other than antibiotics, geography, so northern latitudes, like where New York City is, We have less vitamin D, we're less exposed to the sun, higher risk of IBD. So this has been multiple studies worldwide that the closer you are to the equator, the more vitamin D, the less risk of future IBD development. That has a direct impact on the microbiome. Medications, so we talked about antibiotics, but there's other ones. So NSAIDs, everyone's read that, if you have IBD, you shouldn't take NSAIDs. That's not necessarily true, but NSAIDs also disrupt the gut microbiome and have been associated with the future development of IBD. We heard a great talk on diet, so I'm not going to really go into that. But diet, obviously what you eat has an impact on what microbes are inside of you. And so that's a clear link there. High protein diets, high saturated fat diets are associated with IBD, in particular colitis, which we've heard about. Hormonal contraception also has been shown to increase the risk of subsequent Crohn's. But again, these are just small studies linking the risk. It's not if you do this, it's 100%. No, these are all just sort of aspects that have an influence on the gut microbiome. So one of the things that I study in the lab and also clinically is the impact of infections and the gut microbiome. So if you think about this, there's two ways of thinking about infections, the gut microbiome and inflammatory bowel disease. So when you think about the developing world, there's a lot more exposure actually to microbes, right? When you think about places where there's high parasitic burden, there are more infections. However, in folks from regions, developing countries where there's more microbes, more parasites, they have a much more diverse microbiome, and they have a less risk of immune-mediated diseases. However, if you take folks from, the New York City area, genetic susceptibilities, less vitamin D, less diverse microbiomes, and you give them an infection, they're much more likely to have a negative reaction. And so while infections are more common in places in the developing world, these folks probably have a more diverse microbiome and are much more able to manage that. Whereas when you have an infection and you have not such a diverse microbiome, you have some genetic susceptibility, you're much more likely to get a problem with that. And so here are this is a study basically demonstrating risk of IBD after an infection with Salmonella or Campylobacter, which are two of the most common pathogens that cause gastroenteritis, food poisoning, what have you. So your risk of developing IBD goes up quite a bit. And so if there is susceptibility and you get an infection, it increases your risk. Again, not 100%, but another piece of the picture here of how we're trying to understand the role of microbes and IBD. So it's a little bit of a busy slide, but the point here is that the gut microbiome doesn't happen overnight, right? It even happens in utero. You're developing a microbiome in your GI tract. And over time, there are factors throughout the continuum of life that influence our microbiome, right? So it's genetics and the way we're born, right? C-section versus vaginal delivery, that impacts your microbiome. Kids born C-section have a higher risk of IBD, and again, that's directly linked to changes in the microbiome. We talked about geography, we talked a little bit about hygiene. Folks in the developing world seem to have more diverse microbiomes. Stress we didn't touch on, but that has a direct link. Diet we talked about, other drugs like antibiotics, NSAIDs, all of those contribute to the microbiome. And if you have an unstable microbiome, you're more likely to have a problem with some of these factors and influences. And so this just goes to show that these changes over time can directly influence the microbiome, and that's associated with things like inflammatory bowel disease and other immune-mediated diseases. All right, so what I'll say broadly are that changes in the microbiome are linked to IBD. A lot of that has to do with diversity, right? We found specific microbes that seem to be specifically changed in IBD, but it doesn't mean directly modulating that actually reduces your risk of IBD, right? So we're going to talk about this. So if you're low in Bacteroides, which is one of the types of bacteria that seem to be low in IBD, and you take Bacteroides, that doesn't reduce your risk. So it's not a clear-cut pathway. But these are some of the associations that we found in folks with IBD. And perhaps more important than actually what the microbes inside of you are what those microbes are doing, right? So we talked about their role in immune function and vitamins and whatnot, but they actually do a lot. And so if that composition of the microbiome is off, is dysbiotic, is dysregulated, their function is going to be changed. So in IBD, we see increase in amino acid transport, sulfate transport, oxidative stress, decrease in short-chain fatty acids, which is supposed to be helpful. So it's not just the type of bacteria, but also, or type of microbes, right? It's more than bacteria, but also what they're doing and their products, which are really important. Although we really know very little, which is what this remark is. It remains unclear, what's the most important thing, right? Is this chicken or egg, right? All right, so I want to talk a little bit about how we can manipulate the gut microbiome to be useful. So increasingly, patients and family members are asking me about fecal transplant. So I want to talk about this because there's a lot on the internet about it, and you have to be very careful what you read on a blog. So fecal microbiota transplant, and we're starting to see some of these therapies get approved in other disease states like C. diff, Clostridium difficile, where fecal transplant is being really highlighted. So why might this work? Well, you're taking a consortia of bacteria to try to change one's microbiome. And here, this is just some studies, some actually clinical trials of using fecal transplant in ulcerative colitis. And it actually has a positive benefit. So this was an induction study, induction of clinical remission, that use of fecal transplant actually had benefit, helped put patients in remission. Unfortunately, when you then followed the patients, they basically regress back to their disease microbiome. So fecal transplant's not the answer. It can help you get there, and it may be an adjunctive to infliximab, adalimumab, everything else that we're doing to modulate the immune system. But if you just target the gut microbiome, it can help you a little bit, but you regress back to your disease microbiome. So maybe it's that you need to take a microbial agent every day, but I don't know about you, I wouldn't want to do a colonoscopic fecal transplant every month. That's a little aggressive. But there's efficacy here, and exactly that. You're changing the microbiome that's influencing the immune system, but in patients with IBD, you seem to regress back unless it's a continuous exposure. We use antibiotics a lot, right? I just talked about how bad they were, but they also can be good. So why may they work? Because you're changing the composition of the gut microbiome, right? So we talked about how they increase your risk of IBD, but when you have IBD, sometimes we use these as part of our therapeutic arsenal, right? They have evidence, years ago we used to use it for everyone in post-operative Crohn's. We use it a lot in folks with perianal and fistulizing disease. They help change and alter the composition of the gut microbiota. They also, of course, treat infections, which are common in patients with Crohn's disease. They help reduce translocation. These are some of the places where they have evidence. Pouchitis, there's quite a bit of evidence for antibiotics, and again, directly related to changes in the microbiome. Lots of issues with these studies, but probably the antibiotics that you're hearing most about are Cipro, metronidazole or Flagyl, and rifaximin, which is Xifaxan. And these are probably the most common ones that we use in practice. Augmentin we use quite a bit, but again, once you already have IBD, obviously we're a little bit less worried about causing IBD, but these directly impact the gut microbiome, which is how they function. So I want to review probiotics because this also too is something that comes up quite a bit. Probiotics are bacteria, right? They're microorganisms that are thought to have beneficial properties. And everyone in this room knows what probiotics are, right? We're constantly inundated with ads, and you can't walk into a CVS or a Duane Reade without seeing shelves of these. And I think that there's a lot of perhaps reasons why they could work, right? So suppression of growth of bad actors, improvement in barrier function, help modulate the immune system. We talked about the microbiota influences the immune system. Unfortunately, the data on these is pretty poor. And really, why is that overall? One, if you're taking probiotics by mouth, right, the acidity of your stomach is acidic for a reason, right? It's supposed to be a protective barrier for you. So a lot of the probiotics that you may take by mouth, you're going to really inactivate with the high, with the acidity of your stomach. So that's part one. And the second is we just haven't shown in good studies that a lot of these things do a lot. Now, obviously, any patients will tell me all the time, oh, well, I started taking some brand of this, and they got better. Everyone's a little bit different. But on the whole, in studies, when this is done well, studies have shown probiotics to have virtually no use in inflammatory bowel disease. And again, it speaks to how little we understand about this. So save the $100 a month. Don't do it. Or give it to the Crohn's Colitis Foundation. But I think at the end of the day, we just have to be very cognizant of the targeted ads and whatnot, especially to folks like IBD who may feel a little bit desperate for some help here and think, oh, probiotics, gut microbiome, this is what I need. Unfortunately, the data is just not there. There are very limited data for use of certain types of probiotics in pouchitis, and that's really the only place it's been studied. So many folks in this room have heard of VSL number 3. It's now called Visbiome, and that's been studied in a randomized controlled trial and has demonstrated efficacy for pouchitis, but not great efficacy. But again, in Crohn's and ulcerative colitis, where probiotics have been studied, they've also been studied in C. difficile infections. They seem to have very little, if not any, impact. So unfortunately, we don't really understand what's the right way to use these. And maybe it's not probiotics, right? Because we talked about it's not just the composition of the bugs, but it's what they're doing, what they're doing in your gut, what they're producing, the products. And so that's clearly a missing part here. But save your money for now. And I wanted to leave it open because I get a lot of MyChart messages about probiotics and gut microbiome and what we can do to fix our microbiota. So I wanted to leave time for plenty of questions about the gut microbiome and probiotics and anything else that may come up. So thank you.